Thank you very much. Maybe since I'm the last speaker, I want to take the opportunity to thank all the organizers. It was a very nice week, I think. And although I'm not part of this community, I really enjoyed the talks. So, so today I want to try to describe a result of Agnès Backhaus and Balázs Szegedy about the eigenvectors of random regular graphs. And I'm going first to first let me give my motivation for being interested in their result. The result is seems very close, very linked to a conjecture that in quantum chaos that is called the Berry conjecture. And apparently, they were completely unaware of this conjecture when they proved their results. So this is not their motivation, but it really, their work is really closely related to that conjecture, although they didn't know it. So the conjecture is the following. So it's for eigenfunctions of the Laplacian on manifolds or domains in RD. So if you have M a manifold or a domain in RD, a bounded domain in RD. There should be geometric, so it's a compact manifold, and there should be geometric assumptions. So, for instance, we should assume the manifold to have negative curvature. And if we prefer to work with a bounded domain in RD, we should assume something about the billiard dynamics. So if you have a domain in RD, you can play billiard in it. So imagine that you have a ball that follows the trajectories in straight lines and bounces on the boundary, and we want this dynamical system to have a chaotic property in some sense. So if we work with the domain, we should put this assumption. And the conjecture is the following, that if we look at an eigenfunction of the Laplacian with eigenvalue lambda, so let me make a better picture. We pick a point in the manifold or in the domain, a point x, and we look at a small ball around this point, and we want the radius to be of order several times the wavelength. So here we are going, as yesterday, to look at the limit where lambda goes to infinity. So the wavelength is going to 0, and the wavelength is 1 over square root of lambda. And we look at a ball of very small radius, and the radius is a large number of times, is a multiple of the wavelength. So locally, it looks because the ball is very small, it looks like a Euclidean space. And we zoom. So we zoom of a factor square root of lambda. so that we get a picture in the ball of radius r in Rd. So we look at our eigenfunction we scaled of square root of lambda in this ball. And the conjecture is that what we see should look like a Gaussian process. Okay? Although, so the phi is completely deterministic, but the conjecture is that in some sense what we see should look like a Gaussian process in Rd with a very well identified covariance kernel K of, so it's a covariance kernel that is translation invariant and rotation invariant, and it is the integral over the sphere of dimension d minus 1 of it. So it's the Fourier transform of the measure area on the sphere. So it's a Bessel function basically. In numerics, this conjecture seems to really to be completely verified, but nobody is unable to prove anything. And maybe a first thing is that it's phrased, so it's a physics paper, and it's phrased in a rather vague way, so part of the work is to understand what it means that it should look like a Gaussian process. So in Backhaus and Szegedis work, we look at a similar question for a large graph, a large regular graph, and now instead of looking at lambda going to infinity, we look at finite graphs whose size goes to infinity. So let's try to formulate a similar question for large regular graphs. So I'm going to adopt their notation. So now the degree is d. Yesterday I used it to denote it by q plus 1, but since I'm following their paper, I'm going to denote the degree by d. And there are n vertices. And for the moment, let me first take a deterministic graph, because the question can already be asked for a deterministic graph. So we have this a very large graph. I'm not very good at drawing graphs. So we have a regular graph, very, very large. And what we would like to know, if we pick a point in the graph and look, so we take an eigenfunction of the adjacency matrix. So now lambda stays in a bounding set. We have an eigenfunction of the adjacency matrix. We look at its restriction to a ball of radius r, and we would like to know if it looks like a Gaussian process in some sense. So to formulate more precisely what we mean by look like, we know that the graph looks locally, we're going to assume anyway that the graph looks locally like a tree. So we have an eigenfunction here. Let me lift it. So we first lift. I'm going to lift it to the infinite tree, which is the universal covering graph of this graph G. So it's going to be a regular tree, but the way it is defined is that it is a tree. So now that I have picked the point x, as I decide to label this vertex by x, or x tilde, and the universal covariant tree, its definition is labeled by the non-backtracking path starting from x on the graph. So for instance here, if I have x1, I'm going to label the neighbors of x tilde by all paths of length 1, non-backtracking paths of length 1 starting from x. So this one corresponds to another neighbor. Now at the next step, here if I take a non-backtracking path of length 2 starting from x, I get another point in the tree. And I label this point by the non-backtracking path. So this way I get an infinite tree with a projection from the tree to the graph, and any function defined here can be lifted to this tree. So if I have a function on the graph, I can lift it to the universal covariant tree. So instead of seeing it as a function on this finite graph, I see it as a function on the tree, but it has a certain periodicity condition. Now when I said that the universal covariant tree is a regular tree, there is a slight ambiguity. It's only defined modulo isomorphism. So I'm going here on this blackboard, I'm going to draw a fixed copy of the regular tree. And now, once I have this tree here, I want to identify it with a fixed copy. So it's a bit like on a manifold to choose a coordinate chart. So here I'm going to on this blackboard, I draw a regular rooted tree. And I'm going to identify both, but you see that if I want to identify this one with this one, there is a certain degree of arbitrariness. So even if I decide that x is going to be identified with the root, I have a choice of, I can choose that this guy here is sent either here, or here, or here, or here. So when I want to do this identification of this to here, there is so I want to identify it, but here there is a degree of arbitrariness, so I can do this identification randomly. And this thing already appears in the manifold case because I hid it somehow, but when I said that this small ball can be identified with a ball in RD, I had in mind that I chose a coordinate system. So there is also here a degree of arbitrariness in the way so I push everything to RD, but there is an arbitrariness here. So there is first an arbitrariness in the choice of the base point, but also an arbitrariness here in the way I choose the coordinate system. So even what I want to say here is that even if I start with a deterministic graph and a deterministic function, what I get at the end here is a random function. And the randomness is in the way, first in the way I chose the base point and in the way I chose the coordinate system. So here we get a random lift of the function phi. And in the Backhaus and Szegedy notation, they denote its distribution. So we get a random function on the tree. So the notation is that denoted by dist star of phi g is the law of this random function. So again, it's a bit like in Justin's talk. Even we start by starting with a deterministic thing, we get already a random object. And the question is, can we say when the graph gets large, can we say if this distribution approaches a Gaussian distribution? Is it can? So is it close to a Gaussian process on the tree when the size of the graph gets large? And in fact, if we start with an eigenfunction which is normalized in L2, so if we start with the function that was normalized so that the sum of phi of h squared is equal to 1, we see that we should normalize everything by square root of n. And the result by Backhaus and Szegedy can be summarized by saying that this is true if we first pick the graph at random. Okay, so their theorem is that this is true for a randomly chosen graph. So I'm drawing anyway to phrase the precise result, but if we pick a graph at random and then take any eigenfunction and look at the process that we get on the tree, is going to look like a Gaussian process. Yes?
So what's the intuition, this randomness? Does it come from this random lift or from the randomness of the graph?
In their paper, they use a lot the randomness of the graph.
No, it's a normal short statement.
No, but it's an almost sure statement. So for almost all, if you pick almost any regular graph, and then for this graph you take any eigenfunction and lift it to the tree, the process that you get is going to look like a Gaussian. So I'm not sure. I mean, you could perfectly well ask the same question for deterministic sequences of graph, like the Lubotsky-Phillips-Arnold graph, and it's not known. But it would make sense to ask, because the first construction is deterministic. To start with any given graph, and you can do this construction. So you could ask the same for instance, the Lubotsky-Phillips-Arnold graph. What they say is that if you take a graph that is picked at random, then almost surely, you will have this phenomenon. Are there other questions? And maybe an analog thing to do in the manifold case would be first to say I pick a manifold at random, and then do I almost surely, is the Berry conjecture true almost surely when you pick a manifold at random? So I have defined this notion of random lift and the notation for the distribution of a random lift. Then let me introduce some more notation. So this is their notation for the set of invariant measures on the set of functions on the tree. So in other words, the set of probability measures in other words, the set of random processes. But I want the law to be invariant by the automorphism group of the tree. So I want to consider only random processes on the tree that are invariant, whose law is invariant under automorphism, because all the processes I did this way have this property. Okay, so if I consider such a probability measure, in the probabilistic language is the same as considering that I have a random process on the tree with an invariant law. And in particular, we will be interested in what they call eigenvector processes. So if you have a lambda, a real number, we can define what is an invariant. So if I have an invariant process, we will say that it is an eigenvector process, a lambda eigenvector process, if so we want the function h to be almost surely an eigenfunction of the adjacency matrix, but because of the law is invariant under automorphism, it is sufficient to check it at one point. So we fix an origin in the tree, and we want to have that the sum of HV of x of v over all neighbors of the origin is lambda x of 0, almost surely. Okay, so, and this implies that almost surely x is an eigenfunction of the adjacency matrix of the tree, and there is a normalization that the expectation of, so we normalize the expectation of h of 0 squared to be 1. So we have this normalization condition, and an easy remark is that, so here I didn't impose that the process is centered, but one can see that if the process is not centered, then we must have that the eigenvalue is the trivial one, so lambda is equal to d, just by taking the expectation here. And in fact, because of the finite second moment, we must also have that x is constant almost surely. So the non-centered case is trivial, and we will only consider the case of a centered process. So when you have a random process on the tree that has a second moment, you can consider the covariance kernel. Which is the expectation. So if x and y are 2 points in the tree, we take the expectation of f of of the process at x times the process at y. And if x is a lambda eigenvector process, then we see that, so first, if x is invariant under the automorphism group, then this k depends only on the distance between x and y. So k is actually just a function of the distance. This is by invariance under automorphisms. And also it must be, if I fix x, it must be an eigenfunction of the adjacency matrix for lambda. Okay, so because if the process is an eigenfunction almost surely, then this is by linearity is going also to be true for the covariance kernel. So if I apply, so for instance, if I fix x to be the origin, and if I must have this relation. But we saw, or I told you, that for any lambda, there is only one eigenfunction of the adjacency matrix under tree that is radial. So the covariance kernel is completely determined. So we must have that the covariance kernel is necessarily the spherical function that I was using yesterday. So necessarily, by uniqueness of the radial, of the spherical functions, so necessarily the covariance kernel, there is no choice for the covariance kernel. So all the eigenvector processes have the same covariance kernel, and in particular, there is only one Gaussian process in this class. So corollary, there is a unique Gaussian lambda eigenvector process, because Gaussian processes are determined by their covariance. And we will denote it by x lambda. So x lambda is the unique Gaussian lambda eigenvector process. And the last notation that we need is that this set of probability measures, so of random processes, is equipped with the weak topology. And it's a metrizable topology. So if we want to compare the law of two processes, there is a distance that allows to do that. So on this set, we put capital D, a distance associated to the weak topology. Okay, so this distance allows me to measure if two processes have a law that is closed. And I think now I have all the notation I need to state the result with epsilons and everything. So it's theorem by Backhaus and Szegedy, and I know they put it on the archive in 2016. I don't know if it is published or it's accepted. Okay. So, but it's on the archive, I think, from 2016. Okay, so now I'm going to state the result with epsilons and quantifiers. So if I'm given any epsilon, I can find an n such that if capital G is is a random regular graph with little n vertices, and little n is larger than capital N. Then with large probability on the choice of G. So here now, so here it means that with G this is true for a set of graphs of probability larger than 1 minus epsilon. We have that for every eigenvector phi of G, the distribution, so this is the it's a kind of empirical distribution of the eigenvector. I want to say that this distribution is close to a Gaussian process. So, and I'm going to use the distance d to measure the closeness. So the distance of the distance of the distribution of the eigenvector phi to the Gaussian processes is less than epsilon. So this here is the set of Gaussian eigenvector processes. So here we see that they are able to show that the distribution is close to to a Gaussian distribution, but here there is a scaling sigma, so that is between 0 and 1, so they don't know actually. So this is the variance. Sigma square is the variance, and they don't know that they just know that sigma is between 0 and 1, and this is annoying, but at the moment. Okay, so what does it mean? It means that if I can rewrite it by saying that there exists so I can paraphrase this by saying that there exists a sigma such that the distance between the distribution, the empirical distribution of the eigenvalue of the eigenfunction phi is close to some Gaussian process. But this sigma is quite annoying. So we don't know if sigma is non-zero. So it could be that the limiting Gaussian process is degenerate, that is just a trivial, or that it's just a Dirac mass. I think people would like to, people tend to believe that sigma should be equal to 1, at least maybe in the bulk of the spectrum. We tend to believe that sigma should be equal to 1, maybe restricted to the bulk of the spectrum. But something that is also annoying about this sigma is that the sigma here might depend on, in fact, the sigma, if you look at the proof, I don't know if you agree with me, Justin, but it could very well depend on the eigenfunction you have chosen and on the graph. So it's not even a deterministic sigma, it's a random sigma. So you just know that for each graph and each eigenfunction, you can say that the distribution is close to a Gaussian, but the variance, we don't even know if it's going to be the same for all graphs or all eigenfunctions. So what is the problem with this variance? So maybe I can give a, maybe to understand more clearly what this means. A corollary of the results. So here I'm really, it says something about the distribution of the eigenfunction really as a process, but it's already interesting to look at the value distribution. Yes?
If sigma is random, is it clear that sigma x is still Gaussian?
Yeah, I mean, it's a Gaussian law. Yeah, this means that it's close to a Gaussian law. Just for each of these guys, the distribution is close to a Gaussian law, and you don't know the variance. But so maybe I can just say what it means for the value distribution. So it's a corollary. If I take a finite number f1, fk maybe, I take a finite number of bounded continuous functions. So I'm going to use them to test the weak convergence. Then I can say that for every epsilon, there exists an n such that if G is a random regular graph with at least n vertices with probability larger than 1 minus epsilon, I can say that I can say that 1 over n times the sum over vertices of fi of square root of n. So for all eigenfunctions, I can say that this quantity is close to the one that you would that integral of fi of t exponential minus t square over 2 sigma, so the Gaussian density. And this is the difference between the two is less than epsilon. So in particular, if I want to count the number of vertices such that square root of n phi of h falls into some interval, is going to be close to the Gaussian probability of that interval. But again, the sigma here that works a priori can depend on the eigenfunction. We just know that it's between 0 and 1. And we see what is the problem with the variance is that if we were allowed to take fi of h equal h square, we know that 1 over n we know that if we were allowed to take as a test function the function h square, this quantity is always equal to 1. So at the limit, we would like to believe that the limit invariance is also equal to 1, but the problem is that h square is not a bounded continuous function. So in the definition of the weak convergence, you cannot take h square. So it's really a problem of escape to infinity. another remark to do. So suppose we want to see, so suppose we want to try to rule out sigma equals 0. So what does sigma equals 0 mean? It means that the limiting law is a Dirac mass. So it means that I have an eigenfunction that is very small on a lot of vertices. Okay, so it means that sigma equals 0 means that the value distribution is converging to a Dirac mass. So it means that for every delta, the number of vertices such that square root of n phi of x is larger than delta goes to 0 when n goes to infinity. This is completely equivalent to saying that the value distribution converges to a Dirac mass. Converges to 0. And this is a sign of very strong localization, because if I call V, so it depends on phi and on delta, if I call V the set of such vertices, so on the complement we have that, so on the complement of this set we have that phi of x is less than delta over square root of n. So obviously the sum of phi of x squared over the complement must be less than delta. And so we must have that the sum over V itself of phi of x squared must be greater than 1 minus delta. So we see that if sigma equals 0, means that we can find a set that has a very small cardinality, but that carries almost all the mass of the eigenfunction. So having sigma equals 0 means that we can find a subset of the vertices whose cardinality is little o of n, but the sum of the eigenfunction square on this set is very close to 1. So sigma equals 0 means very strong localization. But unfortunately, all the results that we know on delocalization, so the result I talked about the previous days by Lemasson and myself, so by Bauer, Schmidt-Yang, and Yao, they are not allowed to rule this out. So the known results on delocalization are not sufficiently strong to prevent this, because if you remember what we proved the previous day, we were always fixing a test function. So here the problem is that the bad set a priori could depend on the eigenfunction and on the graph. And in the results I stated the previous day, we were only allowed to test functions that were chosen a priori, so independent on the eigenfunction and independent on the graph. So we cannot, all the delocalization results that are known are not sufficient to prevent this, to know that this is not true. Okay, so I see I'm not going to be able to say much about the proof, but so actually the proof comes from, so it's a corollary of the following. So that proves the following theorem, that if mu, so if R is a typical, so I will have to define what it is to be typical. If mu is a typical lambda eigenvector process, then first we must have that lambda is less than 2 square root of d minus 1, and mu is a Gaussian process. And what does it mean to be typical? If, so it's, quantifiers are a bit subtle, but so it's typical if there exists a sequence of integers going to infinity and a sequence of epsilon I going to 0, such that such that for G, a random regular graph, no, actually, for G, a random regular graph, maybe I'm going to call it GI, a random regular graph having ni vertices, in a set of probability 1 minus epsilon I, there is a map, so there is a function on the vertices of Gi whose distribution is close to mu. So it's quite a bit difficult to digest all the quantifiers, but we say that a measure mu, so a process is typical if on almost all regular graphs we can find a function that has almost this distribution. Yeah, so we want that for most regular graphs, we can find a process on the finite graph that has an empirical distribution close to mu. Okay. And roughly speaking, so I think it's not completely clear that this theorem implies the other theorem. I think I don't have time to explain why this one implies the other one. But to prove this theorem, so there are two main steps. It can be, the proof can be divided into 2 big steps. One step is to prove that typical processes, in this sense, must have a large entropy. And this comes from a large deviation estimate. So there is some notion of entropy for which they can prove that typical processes have large entropy. And the second big part, and each of these parts is quite long, the second part is the characterization of Gaussians as maximizing the entropy. And one difficulty here is that, so I think in 1D, it's not very hard to see that Gaussian maximize the entropy once the variance and mean are fixed. But here one difficulty is that we have a process on an infinite tree, so we are dealing with infinite dimensional Gaussians. So here we are in infinite dimension. So in fact, it's not just one entropy that we should consider, but it's a family of entropies that are related to the process on larger and larger balls. Okay? And maybe I can just, see, I have just 5 minutes left. I can just say a little more about this step, about the entropy step. So let's denote by C the following subgraph of the infinite tree. So it's just a ball, so they denote it C. It's just a ball of radius 1. And E is just it's the following subgraph of the tree. It's an edge. And Bk of C is the ball of radius k around C. So for instance, if I draw it for k equals to 2, it's going to look like that. Okay, so this is the ball of radius k. So it's the points that are distance at most 2 from this subgraph. And similarly, Bk of E is the ball of radius k around this subgraph, this edge. And something they prove, and which is the starting point of this entropy thing. So let me state it. So normally we are interested in real valued processes, but I'm going to state it for processes in a finite set. So okay, I replace, normally I'm interested in processes taking values in R, but I'm going to take kind of discrete version that is, so it's the first step, if you want, in the argument. If I have a process that takes values in a finite set, and now I take a typical process, but with values in F. Then what they prove is that the entropy of this process restricted to the subgraph bk of C is always larger than d/2 times the entropy of the process restricted to bk of E. And this is true for any k. So this is what I said when I said that because we are in infinite dimension, we need infinitely many measures of entropies. We have one entropy for each ball, if you want. And here, so what is the entropy? Because I've decided to replace continuous random variable by discrete ones, and because I'm working on a finite set, so on this finite set, this is a discrete random variable, and I'm just using the definition. For a discrete random variable taking values in a finite set, I'm just using the definition of entropy minus pi log of pi. And here, so why? I don't know if I'm allowed to take 4 more minutes or and anyway. So I think I would like to explain why this is true, because it's just it's a large deviation argument. Then once they have this, because they are interested in real valued processes, they have to from this they have to extract another result that is about the continuous entropy. And after that, they have to show that this continuous entropy is maximized by Gaussian. But let me just say how they prove this. So remember the definition of entropy from statistical mechanics. And this is the basic large deviation principle also. But if you have n sites, and you want to attribute to them a color in a finite set, so to each particle you want to attribute a color in a finite set, and if you count the number of ways to color the sites so that the distribution of colors, so you fix P, a probability measure on F. So P is a probability measure on the set of colors, and you want to count the number of ways to color the sites so that the distribution of colors is P. So that the empirical distribution of colors is P. Then this is roughly exponential n times the entropy of the probability measure P. Meaning more precisely that if you take 1 over n log of this is close to the entropy of P. Okay, you want to attribute to each of the sites, you want to attribute a color, and you want that the empirical distribution of color is close to P. If you do a counting argument, you have a multinomial law, and by Stirling formula, you see that the number of ways to do this coloring is close to exponential n(h) of P. So for instance, if I want to prove this result for, let us just do k equals 0, we can do a counting argument, which comes from this definition of the entropy. You want to count the number, so you are given mu. So mu is the probability measure here. And you want to count the number of regular dwarfs of random regular dwarfs with n vertices such that, so for which the number of F colored, so you are interested in regular dwarfs carrying colored in the set F. So you want to count F colored regular dwarfs with n vertices for which the statistics of colored one neighborhood is close to mu. So you count all the regular dwarfs carrying a coloring and for which the statistics of balls of radius 1 is close to the measure mu that you are interested in. And what they show is that this is roughly the total number of, so I don't know if there is a usual notation for the number of n regular dwarfs, of the d regular dwarfs. So RDN is the total number of d regular dwarfs with n vertices times exponential n times the entropy of mu on the subgraph C divided, so this is modulo some correction. So they do this counting and use exactly this property of the entropy. So the number of F-colored regular dwarfs for which the statistics of one ball is close to mu is divided by the total number of regular dwarfs times exponential n times the entropy of mu on the dwarf C divided by exponential d over 2n times the entropy of mu on 1h. And so now if you want mu to be, what does it mean for mu to be typical? It means that this number here should be comparable. So if you remember the definition of typical, you want that almost all regular dwarfs carry a coloring having the right statistics. So typical exactly means, so for this one has to look again at the definition of typical, but typical means, so mu typical, mu to be typical means that the number of regular dwarfs having a good coloring is comparable to the total number of regular dwarfs. And so we see it's only possible if we have an inequality between the two entropies. So this is roughly the argument for k equals 0, and then you have to do it for all k's. And I have already spoken for too long. Sorry.